Because now, there was someone who did not look at him like he was a god or a nightmare, or a force of nature beyond comprehension. Now, there was someone who didn't look at him at all. "You're slow," the boss said one afternoon, not even glancing up from the documents spread across his desk. His tone clipped precise, dismissive in a way that would have shattered most people. The young man froze for half a second, not because he was hurt, but because he was thinking carefully. "How slow should I be?" he asked softly. The question so quiet it almost disappeared into the space between them. The boss finally looked up, and for a moment, just a moment, something unreadable flickered in his eyes. "Don't waste my time," he said. "Yes, sir." And that was enough. He adjusted. He learned, he watched, not the enemies gathering in the dark, not the hunters whispering about something ancient moving beneath the city, not the other creatures that sensed him and why his lie chose to stay away, but him, the man who gave orders without realizing what they meant, who dismissed danger without understanding it, who walked through a world filled with things that wanted him dead, and lived only because something far worse had decided he would end. The first time it almost broke was over something trivial. It always was. A hand on the boss's shoulder, a smile that lasted too long, a voice that leaned just a little too close. The young man stood in the doorway, watching, expression blank, eyes dim and unfocused in that practiced way that made people forget he was there. But inside something shifted, something old, something that did not understand restraint, or patience, or the fragile human idea of boundaries. That hand did not belong there. "Relax," the other man laughed, oblivious, fingers tightening slightly as he spoke, as if proximity alone gave him permission, as if presence meant access, as if the world had not already decided he was disposable. The air changed subtly, violently, inevitably. "Let go." The voice was soft, too soft, the kind of softness that didn't belong in warnings, only in endings. Everyone turned, including the boss, and for the first time, the young man was not looking down. His eyes were not human. There are moments, rare, fragile, dangerous moments, when something that has spent centuries pretending to be human forgets, just for a second, how to stay contained. And that moment had arrived. No one in that office moved, not because they understood what they were seeing, but because instinct, that ancient animal instinct buried deep beneath logic and pride and ego, had already made the decision for them. Something was wrong. Not loud, not visible, not even fully real in a way they could name, but wrong enough that breathing suddenly felt like a risk. The young man stood there, no longer shrinking, no longer soft, no longer blurred into the background of someone else's importance. And for the first time since anyone had met him, he existed fully. TERRIFYNGLY. Let go. He said it again. Still quiet, still calm. But this time it wasn't a request. The hand on the boss's shoulder tightened reflexively, the man attached to it letting out a short, irritated laugh, the kind people use when they don't understand that they already dead. "Well, what?" he said, turning slightly, annoyance flickering across his face as his gaze landed on someone he clearly did not consider a threat. That was his last mistake, because the distance between them ceased to exist. Not crossed, not closed, not moved through, erased. One moment he was standing there, and the next he wasn't. There was no sound, no struggle, no visible force, just the sudden, impossible absence of a human being who had been there a heartbeat ago, and the faint, almost delicate sound of something hitting the floor. A ring, still spinning. The boss didn't move, didn't react, didn't speak, because unlike the others, he had seen it, not clearly, not completely, but enough. You? The word barely left his mouth before the air itself seemed to tighten, pressure coiling around the room like something alive, something watching, something deciding. And all at once, every light flickered. The young man stood exactly where he had been before, head slightly lowered, hands at his sides, breathing steady, as if nothing had happened, as if someone hadn't just ceased to exist within arm's reach. "I told him to let go," he said softly, and there it was, again, that tone, that careful, deliberate softness. But now, it felt wrong, like silk wrapped around the blade. No one spoke, no one moved, no one dared to even question what they had just witnessed, because whatever part of their minds wanted to deny it was already being crushed under something far more primitive, fear. Only the boss remained still, watching, thinking, calculating. "You did that," he said finally. Not loud, not accusing, just certain. The young man didn't answer immediately, didn't deny, didn't explain, didn't even try to pretend confusion the way he always did when something went wrong around him. Instead he lifted his eyes, and for a moment, just a moment, something ancient looked out through them. He shouldn't have touched you. Silence. Heavy dot, suffocating dot, absolute. The boss's gaze sharpened, something cold and precise locking into place behind his eyes as he stepped forward, not back, not away, not retreating the way any reasonable person would have, but forward. You don't get to decide that, he said. A pause. The young man tilted his head slightly, as if considering that, as if weighing something invisible, something fragile, something that had never mattered before. Rules, limits, permission. Then tell me, he said quietly. The air tightened again. What am I allowed to do when someone tries to take what's mine? The words were soft, almost gentle, but the meaning was not. For the first time, someone else in the room made a sound, a sharp inhale, a step back, a realization breaking too late. The boss didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, didn't look away. You don't own anything here, he said. And that should have been the end of it. A boundary, a command, a correction. But instead something cracked on, not outside, not in the room, not in the fragile human world still trying to pretend that made sense, but inside him, because, for the first time, the answer he wanted wasn't the one he received. The young man's fingers curled slightly at his sides, nails pressing into his palms hard enough to break skin, though no blood fell, no wound remained, no mark stayed long enough to matter. But the motion, the tension, the restraint was real. I see, he said, dot soft, dot too soft. And just like that, everything snapped back into place. The pressure vanished. The lights steadied. The air loosened. The world resumed. He lowered his gaze, stepped back, folded himself neat-lie into the shape everyone expected. I'm sorry, he murmured, as if he hadn't just erased them all from existence. As if the room was unstill, echoing with something none of them could name. As if the boss standing in front of him hadn't just felt, for a fraction of a second, what it meant to be the center of something dangerous. Clean this up, the boss said after a moment. Voice flat, controlled, unreadable. Yes, sir. And that was it. But later, much later, when the building had emptied, when the city had fallen into that quiet, restless stillness that comes just before something goes wrong, the young man stood alone in the dark. And this time, there was no one to watch him pretend. The shadows bent. Not metaphorically, not poetically, actually physically, as if the world itself had forgotten how to behave correctly in his presence, as if reality was optional. They don't understand. A voice whispered from nowhere, or maybe from him. They touch what isn't theirs and expect to live. His eyes lifted slowly, no longer dim, no longer soft, no longer pretending, but burning, cold, endless, hungry. But you told me not to. A pause, a fracture, a war silent, internal violent, because obedience was the only thing holding the world together. And desire was trying very, very hard to tear it apart. Far away, in a room high above the city, the boss stood by the window, looking down at a world that suddenly felt unfamiliar. Because for the first time, he wasn't sure if the thing standing behind him was under his control, or if it ever had been. By the time the hunters arrived, he was already too late. Not because they were slow, not because they lacked preparation, not because the weapons they carried, blessed, engineered, designed across generations to kill things that should not exist, were ineffective, but because the thing they had come for had already chosen not to hide. The city felt it first, not in a way anyone could explain, not something the news could report or the systems could track, but in the quiet, subtle wrongness of everything. The way dogs refused to bark, the way the night seemed thicker than usual, the way people paused for no reason at all, as if something deep in their bones was whispering, stay still. High above it all, in that office that at once felt like the center of control, the boss stood alone. Except he wasn't. You knew. The voice behind him said softly. No footsteps, no door, no transition between absence and presence, just existence. The boss didn't turn immediately, didn't react the way someone should when faced with something that had already proven it could erase people from reality itself. Because by now fear was no longer useful. I suspected, he answered. Honest, measured, controlled. A pause. And you stayed, the voice continued. Not surprised, not grateful, just noting. Now he turned slowly, deliberately. And for the first time, he didn't see the version of him that everyone else did. No lowered gaze, no softened edges, no careful, practiced fragility designed to make people look away. There was no pretending anymore. What stood in front of him looked human, perfectly, unnaturally, every detail precise enough to pass, every expression controlled enough to mimic. But the eyes were wrong. Not monstrous, not grotesque, not something that could be easily rejected. Something worse. They were empty of limits. You should have left, the young man said. Why? The boss asked. And there it was. The question that mattered. Not what are you, not how did you do that. Not how many people have you killed, but why? That something shifted that subtly, that deeply. Because that question was dangerous. Because they're coming, he said quietly. As if on cue, the glass behind them exploded inward, not shattered erased. A figure stepped through the opening that no longer existed. Long coat whipping in a wind. That shouldn't they've been there. Eyes sharp focused, locked onto one target. Target confirmed, the hunter said. Behind him others followed. 5, 10, more. Weapons raised. Symbols carved into steel. Light bending unnaturally. Around our presence, they were prepared. They had to be. Because they were hunting something that had once ended entire bloodlines without leaving a trace. You've been hard to find, the lead hunter continued, voice calm, almost respectful. The young man didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge him, didn't even move, because none of them mattered. Step aside, the hunter said to the boss. Silence. The boss didn't move. You're in the way. Still. Nothing. And then. Slowly the boss spoke. No. The word landed heavier than he should have. Heavier than logic allowed. Heavier than survival justified. Because this was the moment where everything should have broken. Human against monster. Power against control. Fear against instinct. But instead, something else happened. The young man closed his eyes. Just for a second. And when he opened them again, the world stopped pretending. The air collapsed inward. The floor cracked beneath invisible weight. Every light died at once, not flickering, not failing, refusing to exist. And in that darkness something vast unfolded. Not physically, not in a way the eye could fully comprehend, but in presence, in certainty, in the undeniable, suffocating realization that this was not a creature, not a species, not something that belonged to the same rules as anything else in existence. This was a calamity. One of the hunters fired. Instinct. Training. Desperation. The bullet never reached him. It stopped, hung in the air, trembling, and then, quietly it turned to dust. No, the young man said softly. And everything ended. Not exploded. Not shattered. Not destroyed in some dramatic visible way. Just ended. Sound vanished. Movement ceased. Existence paused and then resumed. Without them, the hunters were gone. All of them. No bodies. No blood. No evidence. Just absence. The silence that followed was absolute. I told you to leave, he said, almost gently, as if that had been enough to save them, as if anything ever could have. Behind him, the boss exhaled slowly, not shocked, not afraid, thinking. You didn't answer my question, he said. The young man froze. Why? The boss repeated, stepping forward now, closing the distance that no one else had been allowed to cross. Why me? And that was the one thing he had never prepared for. Because power was simple. Violence was easy. Destruction was instinct. But this required something else. Because you don't fear me, he said finally. A pause. And that matters? The boss asked. The young man shook his head slowly. No. Another step closer? It's because he stopped. Because the truth was too much. Too exposed. Too fragile for something like him to hold. Because I chose you. Silence. Heavy. Irreversible. You could control the world, the boss said. I could destroy it, he corrected quietly. A breath. Then why don't you? And there it was. The final answer. The one thing that held everything together, or doomed it completely. The young man looked at him, not as a superior, not as a master, not even as something above him, but as the only thing that mattered. Because you didn't tell me to. The air stilled. The meaning settled. And for the first time, the boss understood. Not the power, not the scale, not the thing standing in front of him that could erase existence with a thought. But the choice, the deliberate, terrifying, absolute choice, to obey. And if I do, he asked quietly. A smile, small. Soft. Beautiful and utterly wrong. Then it ends. A pause. And if I tell you to stop, another step closer. Close enough now that something like him should never have allowed. Then it stops. No hesitation, no doubt, no condition. Only truth. The boss held his gaze for a long moment. Then slowly he reached out and touched him. No one had done that. No one had been allowed to. No one had survived trying, but he did. And nothing happened. Because this was different. Stay, he said. Just one word. Simple. Clear. Absolute. And just like that the world was safe again. The young man closed his eyes, not in restraint, not in control, but in something dangerously close to peace. Yes, sir. Because in the end, he was never pretending to be weak. He was pretending to be contained, and now, he didn't have to pretend anymore, as long as the one person he chose never told him to let go. It happened, not in a war, not in chaos, not even in one of those moments where the world feels like it's about to collapse, but in something far smaller, far more human. A misunderstanding. Days had passed since that night. The city had returned to normal. At least on the surface, people went to work. Traffic filled the streets. Voices overlapped in cafes and board rooms as if nothing had ever gone missing, as if entire groups of armed hunters had not been erased from existence without a trace, because no one remembered them. No one except him, and the one who chose to stay. Everything was quiet, stable, controlled. Too controlled. Because something like him, something that had spent centuries existing without limits, without permission, without restraint, was now holding himself together with a single thread, a command. Stay. And as long as that word remained, everything held. He stood where he always did, slightly behind, slightly to the side. Presence softened, edges blurred, eyes lowered just enough to be ignored by everyone who didn't know better. But the difference now was that he wasn't pretending. He was choosing every second, every breath, every moment he didn't tear the world open just to see what would fall out was a decision, and all of it depended on him. The boss didn't notice at first. Well, maybe he did, but misunderstood. Because from his perspective, nothing had changed. Deadlines still existed. Mistakes still mattered. People still failed. You're distracted. The words came sharp, sudden, cutting through the quiet of the office like something routine, something ordinary, something that had been said 100 times before, and that was the problem. The young man stilled, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but something inside him tightened. I'm sorry, he said softly. A pause. You've been mo contessa lato. Another pause. Yes, sir. Still calm, still controlled, still holding until focus, the boss said, irritation slipping through now. Subtle but real, the kind that comes from someone used to being used to being understood without explanation. Or don't stand there at all. Silence, and then the mistake. If you can't do your job properly, a breath, a shift, a fracture beginning to form, then leave. The word barely registered, because to him it wasn't a suggestion, not a figure of speech, not frustration, not human. It was a command. The thread snapped. Not loudly, not violently, not just completely. For a moment nothing happened. The young man stood there, exactly as before, head slightly lowered. Posture unchanged, presence small, quiet, harmless. Understood, he said, and then he stepped back, one step, and the world began to come apart. At first, no one noticed. Why would they? Reality doesn't usually announce when it's about to stop working. The lights flickered once, twice. A screen went black. Someone frowned. What's wrong with the system? And then the sound cut off, mid-sentence, mid-breath, mid-thought. Because sound no longer existed. The boss turned sharply. Nothing came out. Because language was gone. Not removed. Not silenced. Unmade. The young man stood near the doorway now, no longer pretending, no longer contained, no longer held together by something as fragile as a human command, and for the first time he wasn't looking at him. Because there was no reason to. The order had been given, leave. So he did. Not the room, not the building, not the city, the world. And as he let go, everything else followed. Time stuttered. Space folded. Structures collapsed inward without falling. People froze in impossible positions, their existence halting like unfinished sentences that would never reach their end, because the thing that had been quietly, invisibly, impossibly holding it all together was no longer trying. The boss moved, forced himself forward against something that felt like pressure, like gravity turning hostile, like reality itself rejecting motion, reaching toward him. Because instinct, or something deeper than instinct, understood before logic ever could, this was wrong. He tried to speak. Nothing. Tried again. Still nothing. Because words didn't exist anymore. But intention did. And somehow that was enough. The young man paused, just slightly. Because even now, even like this, he still responded. Slowly he turned his head and looked at him. Not with softness, not with restraint, not with that careful, fragile imitation of humanity he had worn so perfectly, but with something vast, endless, detached. "You told me to leave." The voice wasn't heard. It was understood, directly, absolutely. The boss forced another step forward, hand lifting, reaching, refusing to stop even as the world around him continued to unravel, as everything he had ever known began to collapse into something unrecognizable. No, this time sound returned. Just one word. Cracked. Broken. Desperate. And that was enough. Because for something like him, one word was everything. The unraveling stopped. Not reversed. Not fixed. Just paused. Caught between existence and nothing. Balanced on a knife's edge that should not have been possible. The young man watched him, quiet, waiting. Because now the command had changed. The boss's hand finally reached him, fingers closing around his wrist, grounding, anchoring, holding onto the only thing left that still made sense. Stay. A breath. A silence. A decision. And then everything snapped back. Violently. Instantly. Completely. Sound returned. Life flooded back. Time resumed. Reality reassembled itself as if it had never been broken, but the memory remained. The boss staggered slightly, breath uneven now, control fractured, composure cracked just enough to reveal what had almost happened, what would have happened if he had been even 1 second slower. "Don't say that again," he said, voice low, rough, no longer commanding but warning. The young man tilted his head slightly. "Say what?" A pause. The boss met his gaze. "Leave." Silence. And then slowly that small, soft, terrifying smile returned. "Then don't tell me to." Because this time they both understood. There were no second chances. Only commands. And consequences.